Something I didn't mention yesterday about Gen X. Consistently since the 90s, they volunteer their time or money or both consistently since the 90s. But usually it's to local charities type or, fundraisers. And they research them heavily before they'll donate their time or money. That's consistently since the 90s. Yet the 90s, even though through the 90s were still, in some cases, the formative years for Gen X, the younger Gen X part groups, for the older ones that were adults, it's been consistent since the 90s that they do that. So how is it? And they're the biggest generation to donate time or money, even if it's a small amount of money. Biggest generation to donate time and money to local charities. The biggest generation, most especially I'm talking about the latchkey kids in this video, okay? Because 40% of Gen Xers were latchkey kids. They were parentless. They had parents, but they raised themselves. That's how, much the parent wasn't around. Yet you'd think that this generation, they have, especially latchkey kids, they should go on to be like murderers or in prison for life. But it's not what happened. They got in a lot of trouble because they were raising themselves and, some juvenile delinquents and truant from school and, drugs and alcohol experiment, all that stuff. But who they ended up going on to be is a total miracle. Total miracle. Because for all intents and purposes, they all should have, especially the latchkey group, they should have ended up, as murderers or something. Just totally, but they didn't. Not only that, they went on to give more time than any other generation, give more dollars to local causes than any other generation. They went on to make sure that their kids didn't end up in the circumstances they were in, so they nurtured. Many have said in the past several years that Gen X messed up in how they raised their kids. I don't know about that. I think it's the problem is that you'll get that, you have everybody that's been pulled into the parasitic factions of LGB, the parasitic faction of Turning Point. They're all of them. They're not political parties. They just attach like parasites to the political parties, and then they get people to follow them. And then the juvenile Charlie Kirk now has created a bunch of Gen Zers that don't know their ass from a hole in the ground, okay, that whine and complain about their circumstances. Are you kidding me? So see, to Gen X, especially latchkey kids, Gen X, we're just like, fuck you. Sorry. I should, again, I'm always a work in progress for God. Of course, the latchkey kids are. But here's the thing. We don't complain. We've never complained about our circumstances. Because we do not form organizations. We do not form a group. We don't. How did that happen? How did the latchkey kids, how did Gen X, how did they end up being the most faithful to God, not necessarily religion, but the most faithful to God for over 2 decades, be the most generous, be the most giving, try to do it differently with their kids, and yet not complain, not be pulled into any factions? How did that manage to happen, especially with this group that wasn't nurtured? They weren't, that's what, like the most traumatic generation was the silent generation. That would be like my grandmother's, because of the depression and so many things. They were the most traumatized generation, the silent one. So even though, there was trauma in Gen X's, childhood, and for the latchkey kids, how did they end up normal? Some people would say they're probably not normal. No, they are. How did they end up going on to try to do it differently with their kids, to be the biggest generation to donate or give time, and to be the biggest generation that's been faithful to God for over 2 decades? How did that happen with latchkey kids? And not get pulled in to these factions that every other generation gets pulled into. How did it not? How did that happen? God. It proves it's in the Bible, and I never thought about it. I mean, the latchkey kids, they're the meek. We weren't complaining about our circumstances, and we had plenty to complain about, but we didn't. We were not nurtured. We were not raised. That's why they consider the latchkey kids very feral. I think feral is a harsh word, because I think that Gen Xers, especially latchkey kids, do care. They have a lot of care in them. It's just we don't put up with bullshit. We call bullshit out, but here's the thing that is overlooked. Because people would say, we don't have any evidence for this. Well, I think there's enough evidence, because seriously, everything points that this group should have ended up a total mess. And they, in some cases, they did. I mean, I ended up an alcoholic, but I don't, that could be for many reasons. But as far as, you would think that most of them, being that there was no nurturing, there was no raising, they would have went on to be murderers or just in prison for they didn't. 40% of Gen Xers were latchkey kids. They were not nurtured. They were alone. So how did they turn out to be the most quiet, not get pulled into anything, not complain, be the most giving generation and the most loyal to God? Because of God. It's in the Bible. Jesus refers to the meek in the Beatitudes. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. God is near to the brokenhearted. He watches over them. And what's most important is that Jesus is a father to the fatherless. That's why. Even though latchkey kids didn't realize it, that's why. Otherwise, you know. That's the miracle of it. God reveals that He is the protector and father to those who are without earthly parents, emphasizing divine care for the vulnerable. He positions Himself as the ultimate guardian, hearing the cries of the parentless and intervening on their behalf. And that's what He did with the latchkey kids. Even though, yes, there were hardships and trials all the latchkey kids went through, still do in many cases, they didn't go on to complain about their circumstances like Gen Z. They didn't end up being a generation full of just self-focused and self-centered, it being all about me. They weren't a generation that would ever get on board with being an organized group, because God, even though He was molding us. In many ways, it's a blessing, because you could say, yeah, we had parents, but we were raising ourselves. It's that they were not latchkey kids were not a nurtured generation. But they ended up being some of the people with the biggest hearts. Not to complain about their circumstances, but to try to go on to do it differently. So that's why we can't stand to hear any other generations carry on, and they're whining and complaining, but this world loves that crap. So anyway, so generations: boomers, Gen X, millennials, Gen Z. The speaking up style of each. Baby boomers are outspoken protests, back in my day rants. Gen X, we're sarcastic. That's a coping thing for us. Low key and indifferent is Gen X. Millennials and Gen Zs, social media complaints, victim narratives. Yet the most victim, besides the silent generation, okay? They were the most traumatized, but for our living time, currently, out of the baby boomers, Gen X, millennial, the biggest generation that has the most to really complain about is Gen X, but we don't. And the perception of each: baby boomers, loud, self-focused; Gen X, quiet, resilient; millennials, Gen Z, vocal and expectant. God raised the latchkey kids, and we didn't even know it.